this on? Do you hear me? Okay. How is everyone? Okay. My name's Tim Sutton. I'm from Montreal, Canada. I work at Concordia University in the Faculty of Fine Arts. So I came here today to commiserate with you all about software. So supporting a lot of students and faculty in the arts, I get questions like this all the time. It's a pretty regular request. Can you please install the newest version of Maya for the next semester, next week? And immediately I think about Maya. So Maya is that one that I have this crazy custom installer written in Qt. I start remembering that, oh yeah, there's these instructions on their website about how to deploy it, that they keep referring to the RPM. I remember that even once I go through all those instructions and I manage to get the thing installed, that it's not really going to remember all the options I gave the installer. They don't really ever quite work completely, so I've got to go through and deal with these windows, make sure that the program actually launches okay. And then I remember that with every version of these applications that we've deployed, for every year for Maya and Mudbox, something changes just ever so slightly. So every year I've got to figure out what exactly moved around for configuring our licensing and our network and license server and the serial number. And just to add a little bit more pain, I remember that I can't even test Maya installs in a VM because it crashes, because it doesn't like the graphics card. So I have to test this on a physical machine as well. And I think about this, I think back to the first time that I saw the movie Clerks. Probably some of you have seen this movie. And I think about the first time I saw it, there's a recurring theme of this idea where people are so annoyed and frustrated by things that, like the state of things that are external to them, they're blaming it on other people or other circumstances instead of taking responsibility. And this is kind of the central dilemma of the main character Dante, and his coworker Randall is actually kind of gets this main idea, but he's always the one who's saying, this job would really, really be great if it only wasn't for the customers. This is a recurring theme through the movie. And so this is always how I feel about software whenever I'm struggling with these installers and software deployment. But then I have to remember and remind myself that the software is actually the reason people use computers. It's the thing that helps us accomplish something, and the software is actually just a means to an end for what your organization or your customers that you support actually do. So supporting this work usually means doing whatever's necessary to give them the tools that they need to do it. So at this point, I think we're all sold on the idea that tools like this, like these, are very beneficial for helping us manage a fleet of Mac or Apple devices. They help us automate complex installation tasks, and they help us scale in a much more, it's actually feasible to scale the number of machines that you manage using tools like this instead of relying on just staffing up your help desk. But it's easy to be deceived by these systems all the same, that the software that you're installing is really actually functioning properly. So sometimes an installer or an application may look like it's installed, but it's not really installed. It sort of wants to install itself as part of running it for the first time. Or the application might sort of work once you deploy it, but it keeps bugging people for admin rights, and they don't really know why. They don't really know what it's trying to do. We don't really know what it's trying to do. And the users may well not be admins and have rights to do this in the first place. If you ever deployed Office, you've seen probably this very specific security warning before. And if you're diligently managing updates on behalf of users, maybe using tools like auto-package and regularly deploying those out, you know that no install of an application is ever complete without having to figure out how to disable the auto-updater that's built into the app. We've also got a lot of cases where we will want to preset some custom information, like a host name, or something that we wouldn't normally expect the user to have to go and look up or find out or figure out how to configure. This is a lecture capture system that we have set up on a number of different environments, kind of like this actually. where we can preset a lot of options. Because this particular application uses standard Apple preferences, we can use defaults, or we can use configuration profiles, etc., to set those preferences on behalf of all the users. Another problem could be that the application just doesn't have a standard installer in the first place. So you've got to figure out how can you deploy this using your management tools in an automated way. So why is all of this so painful? Do you ever struggle with these issues and think that maybe does everybody think, like, when there's a big issue with some application that won't run, won't install, do people think that I must suck at doing this because when they can run the software at home, everything works fine, but for some reason my work computer, like, the permissions are all screwed up and it's always bugging me for my password? What's wrong with the IT department? There can be all kinds of reasons why, but specifically there's a few I find you can usually boil it down to. There's differences with how management tools have to install software versus when somebody does it manually. There's differences with assumptions that are made that aren't always the case with multi-user environments, and non-admin users as well. But the reason that we actually go through the effort to do all this is because we want people to have a very good user experience when they are using a machine that we support. We want that if somebody signs into a computer, for example, I support a lot of lab and studio environments, if somebody signs in, they can expect that all the software is there and it works. It's not going to be bugging them for licensing information, for example. If somebody installs a software through like a self-service or managed software center, that everything's going to be pre-configured and work properly. If we use deployment tools and automated means to install software, then you have a much more consistent, you've installed the software in a much more consistent way. And so you know that doing future updates and upgrades to those, you can do those with more confidence because you know what your initial state is across a large number of machines. And then, for example, I spend so much time dealing with keeping up with Adobe updates and Adobe applications, for example. But the advantages at the time that I put into doing that for all the different, like over a dozen different sort of specialized areas, they each have their own local technicians, et cetera, that for all those groups, Adobe updates are now a complete non-event. So they say, yes, we want to upgrade to 2017, and it's done, and it's automated, and it works pretty well. So besides the Mac App Store, I use the same Google Chrome. You guys did as well. So the same, you've got drag and drop bundles, which are usually pretty straightforward. And usually self-contained, but then you've got installer packages and then custom installer apps. And those two are usually where things start to get more complicated. So we'll start off with installer packages. They're a universally supported way to install systems anywhere or install files anywhere on your system that's not protected by SIP. They're supported by pretty much every deployment tool out there. Pacifist is a GUI application or package sort of viewer utility, which is nice for doing slides like this. And on Mac OS, packages are pretty easy to pull apart compared to something like Windows. This is a package payload for Avid QuickTime codecs, and so we're just looking at the file payloads in this case. A couple other applications. Suspicious package is also a nice GUI utility, which is also free. Pacifist is shareware, but it's sort of like donationware almost. Suspicious package has a nice quick look plugin as well. And you definitely want to be familiar with the built-in package-related binaries that are on every Mac OS system. But installers, besides files, can also run scripts. And that turns a package into a vehicle for running arbitrary code on your system, running as root. And that code can run binaries that are included and shipped along with the package, so they're foreign. The code also happens to make a lot of assumptions, often we find, about the environment in which they're being run, as opposed to when a user just downloads and double-clicks a package. If nothing else, though, a tool like this is helpful just to quickly be able to see immediately whether or not there are installer scripts at all in a given package. And it's always good to know, and then at least try to take a look and have a rough idea of what they're doing. Installer scripts have a very fine, they run a very fine line between the system and the user, because the software developer has to install files on the system in a system protected location, but for one reason or another they may also want to try to do things on behalf of the user to try to help guide them into maybe using the software, or registering, or they want to put something in your dock, etc. But when your management tools install a package, so Monkey or Jamp, for example, install a package, they're effectively running this command to do the installation. Maybe in a bit of a different context, but they're doing it the same way that you would do in the terminal. And this has an important effect of changing the variables, these two environment variables, which are used a lot in installer scripts. It no longer becomes the user that's running the package, but it becomes root, and my home is no longer my home folder, but it's var root. Installer scripts often use commands like defaults or launch control or AppleScript or other commands which have a lot of context around which user runs them. And what they'll often do is they will wrap those commands with something like this to try to make it as if your user is running them, so that way it can run in the same context or as close as possible to somebody just typing it in themselves in the terminal. But in this case, like if user is root, then you're running those commands as root. And there's a lot of cases where that's not acknowledged in the scripts. It also doesn't answer the question of what should be the right behavior for a system where you just want the software configured properly for any user that would use it. So either a multi-user environment, or even if the software is configured at the login window, then it doesn't need to configure anything on behalf of the users as well. Is it doing something important for the software in doing that, or is it just putting it in your dock, or trying to put it into your dock and failing? Skype for Business has this is a current package installer, the most recent one, and this is a fairly short post-install script, but it illustrates a couple of those things. So you've got the AppleScript commands here, which are doing things mostly that are user-centric. You've got that sudo-user, sudo-u user pattern I mentioned just earlier. This register default app and set doc tiles binaries are part of the package, so we don't really know exactly what those do. We can maybe make a couple of guesses, but running this at the login window will generate a bunch of errors, as you can see here, because these commands don't really make sense if you're running it at the login window. There's no user, really, that these things can operate on in this case, or they require a GUI. But then what's important here is that the script exits 0. So no matter what happens during this script, it's still going to succeed. The installer will succeed. It'll continue. So what Skype for Business could have done in this case is they could have stolen an idea from the rest of the Office and the Skype teams are separate, I know, but there's a variable that's set when you run a command line installer called command underscore line underscore install, and when that is set, you can always check that in your script to behave, for the script to do something different conditionally. So in this case of Outlook, it's doing some user-specific stuff, but only if it's not a command line install. It knows, so if you see that in a script, you can usually have some slightly at least increased confidence that the vendor knows that command line installs are a thing, and that you can look at it, see, okay, what have they decided that is not relevant to do when there's not a user running the package. Someone posted this on Slack, I think just very recently, and it was kind of I thought it made a good example. It's an audio driver installer package, and the payload is basically fine. The permissions are all fine. The payload is actually the files that are being copied. It's not copying them somewhere else and then moving them with the script. For the most part, there is a little bit of that going on. So the script has some things that probably maybe aren't really necessary, but it's okay. It doesn't really cause any issues. But I noticed right away at the end, the last line is an open command. So open is analogous to double-clicking and running something. If it's such that there isn't an environment possible for a user to open that app at the end of the installer, that command fails, like it exits non-zero. But because it's also the last command in the script exits non-zero. The installer considers it a failure, because if a post-install script fails, then the installer fails. But what happens here is that the payload did already get copied to the system. The rest of the script did actually run. So the stuff is installed, it works, but your system, your management tools will have reported that the install failed. There's no package receipt recorded if an installer fails for any reason, then there's no package receipt. So the system doesn't think it's installed either. So your management tools may well try to be reinstalling it, because as far as they were concerned, this thing was never installed. This is the error of what it looks like when it's trying to run the open command. And then this just illustrates that there are different contexts in which you can try to install something. Just doing even, like if I do a sudo installer at the terminal while I've got my logged in session as the same user, it's okay. But trying to trigger this install through Monkey even while the user's logged in doesn't work, because Monkey's sort of running in a different context, driven through a launch daemon. So you can see here in these 4 different scenarios, only one scenario actually works. So it's important to test all those cases with your tools. One way to mitigate this would be to unpack that installer and just nix that last line from the post-install script, and then repack it. Another similar example, well, also audio related at least, is a Pro Tools installer a Pro Tools audio instrument plugin, which it naively tries to figure out who your home user who your user is based on your home directory. It also then tries to figure out what path your preferences must be living in. So if you're following along, that would be actually user's root if you were running this as a command line install. And then it goes and runs a bunch of defaults rights commands to essentially configure the application. And then because it's doing this as root, it knows at the end that it's going to have to fix up the permissions and chone the thing back to the user that it thinks you are. But again, this is not, like, that path doesn't even really exist. User's root normally isn't a path that exists on a system. But the worst part about this script is that those preferences are actually essential to the functioning of the software. So when I try to load this plugin in Pro Tools, it's going to complain that it can't find any of its content or settings because it's not configured. It's going to prompt the user instead to go and navigate to where the default I see Neil's nodding. So it's essentially making the user configure the plugin for itself. Basically, point me at my defaults, please. So a simple solution around this, like the simplest possible solution, is that you could instead, because it is using standard macOS preferences, you could instead target any user domain by /library/preferences. When an app is, in most cases, the API that it will use to read preferences will usually fall back to reading the any user domain if it's not configured for the user. You could use a configuration profile here as well. So this is kind of an anti-pattern we see a lot. Well, we see sometimes with installers where it's not enough that the application wasn't written to automatically figure out its own defaults. It actually expects something to happen in the installer to configure it. So it should be just baked into the app, but it's not. Sometimes this ambiguity about users and like root versus the GUI users causes issues just because of POSIX file permissions. Adobe Animate had an issue recently that lasted quite a while, where if you downloaded a package from the dashboard, or if you built a package with Creative Cloud Packager, and you just installed that package while a user was logged in, but you did it, using this method, like an automated method or via Monkey or whatnot, there was a good chance that the app would immediately crash when it launched with an error saying that it doesn't have permissions to write into its own preferences folder. And this is because it appeared so that the preferences folder actually had a file created in it owned by root, and which only root could write into. Because Adobe's tools are all basically proprietary, we can't really modify them easily. The simplest workaround here would be to require a logout for this particular installer so that it can't try to figure out that there's a GUI user logged in and that it's going to try to modify that user's preferences. And again, this is sort of like the previous example. I don't think you should really ever be configuring software as part of an installer. I think that's not a good model, because if the installer is running as root, then there's so many sort of issues that can happen as a fallout of permissions, and if it's trying to modify your preferences. And Adobe Animate is able to create this folder on its own if it doesn't exist. So why have the installer require that it has to set that up for you? And sometimes the permissions are actually messed up in the package payload too. So this is an audio encoder library that can be installed alongside the Audacity free audio editor. And what it does, it looks sane by the package. It's going to install in user local lib, and it's going to create a directory called Audacity and put the encoder inside that. But when we would install this, we'd see that actually somebody can't export MP3s. It can't find the library. It's looking in the right location by default. So what was going on? What happened is that when it did install the library, it set the permissions of the lib folder. So user local lib has some different weird owner. And if I view the directory listing as just numerical instead of the names, it's 501. So what it did is it created this weird permissions on user local lib that no other user can read or write from. And so obviously Audacity can't load that library when it tries to. What happened if we look at the BOM? So from Pacifist it looks fine, but if I use the command line utility to actually list the BOM, the bill of materials, the permissions on those two items beneath are fine, but the permissions on the outermost container, like the object, the path that is going to resolve to user local lib has permissions owned by 501, and the permissions are the mode is 700. So it essentially locks all other users besides 501 out of whatever's in user local lib. And that's actually a pretty common pattern I see, where you'll see the 501 user in the package payload. And I find a lot of the times it's just not an issue in practice, because the permissions are it's read for all users anyway, or read execute. So there's a lot of packages where you have a 501 user though. So this all just goes to show that when you do your testing and you test to see if the software is actually working properly, don't use the 501 user. Use your network user or some other user besides 501. I've seen packages that have 502, 503, like packages that were maybe built by some kind of automated system where they created a second user, and so anyway, so just don't use 501, maybe 502 to do tests for some of these things, because you can find permissions issues in the installers. And my usual process for testing this stuff is that I'll throw it into Monkey in a VM, maybe after having quickly looked at the package, but because all it really matters is what happens when you install it, I'll trigger and install the login window. I'll tail the log for install.log, look to see if there's anything, if there are a lot of scary errors that happen in the installer log. I'll look inside that var root library as well. On a clean enough system, there's usually nothing really in there besides maybe a few things from Apple. So if you see something put in there by a vendor erroneously, then it'll usually stand out. And if I come back to the machine and I see that it created a root folder in /users, like that avid package did, then I know that maybe I've got to assess whether or not I'm going to do something more to try to fix that issue, or maybe look at its scripts in more detail. And I thought the screenshot was hilarious because it also somehow managed to create these. And I think that that's the output of the rvm command. And I don't know what happened here, but it happened in a VM, and so I'm glad that it stayed inside a VM. So do as much testing in a VM as possible when you're running random packages you downloaded from the internet. And then that last example I mentioned, where you've got an installer that you have no idea how to deploy automatically. A lot of the times there are actually supported, there's a vendor-supported way to do a command line install. Whether or not it's that pleasant an experience, not maybe if it requires a JVM just to install it, maybe not so much. But the usual pattern for doing this, if you need to just quickly wrap it into a package, is you build a package payload, put the installer in /temp, So in this case for Sophos, I'm putting Sophos and a configuration in /temp. You write a short post-install script that just runs the installer and cleans up your temporary installer files. And you can use -E so that it will actually, if the installer does fail and if it properly returns a non-zero exit code, then your installer will fail and it won't look like it succeeded to your management tools. And then if your tools can do a script removal as well, then you can also do something like this to remove it. Important to also clean up the package receipt when you're done. And one last item is that if you are looking at any particular installer that is, you're having some issues with permissions like this or any of the things I described, see if there are existing auto package recipes, for example, because it's quite possible that someone else has already kind of struggled with a particular piece of software, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So I mentioned the big sort of motivator really is to not bug users with all kinds of issues that can happen with the software that we deploy. Like I mentioned, we're big on supporting Adobe applications, and for the most part, we can use Creative Cloud Packager and we can build separate little packages for every single app. So that way, we're very flexible with which versions of what we deploy to different areas. Generally, we try to keep people all on the same major versions, but it's possible that we need to be flexible enough with which applications go out to which environments and which machines. And we support named and serialized licenses for different cases, so we can also layer on a license package if we need to. I've written up and talked about before about a utility that I've written for sort of helping streamline the license files that you get from Adobe into a package. So we can layer that on as well, and then we can also add other new applications onto a machine after the fact. Like later, once somebody requests a different version, we can add the updates that come out later. But recently, Adobe went and they redid their installer package. They redid their installer engine completely. It was a big rewrite. It's quite different. It's sad that we have to know a lot about the internals of Adobe packaging, but we do. So there's this unintended side effect with this newer installer engine, which is that if you install a license for an application or a licensed package, but then later you want to install an update to that package or a new version of a new application that's made with this newer installer technology, when you install that, if it doesn't carry its own license along with it, then when you first run it, users get this sign-in, this big dialogue that doesn't really look like the software is properly licensed, because normally if users are used to it just working without requiring an Adobe ID, it's confusing. It's confusing to us as well, because we're not really sure if the licensing is really working. If they figure out how to close the window, they can still quit the window, and then the application still launches and functions in the background. So it's not that it breaks the software, but it looks like it is broken effectively. We figured out from enough testing and talking with people in the community that you could reinstall the license file after the fact, and then it would fix this problem. So if you would reinstall the license file after every single application update you push out, then it's fine. CC 17 was released in November, and I have 26 items in my Monkey repo just for 13 applications that we support that have 2017 versions. So it's roughly, it's about every 3.5 days we've got a new version of something. So I'd rather not have to reinstall my license every 3.5 days. But seriously, because I don't feel great touching the licensing system that often. And it's clumsy to try to coordinate that. So I did get curious recently about what was actually getting modified on the system when you do that license install, because it does seem to fix it. And it's really good timing that you mentioned that you never use the snapshot feature in Composer, because that's the one feature I do use in Composer. I don't really use it to build packages, but I find that it's a nice, concise way of getting a summary of changes that you made before and after you install software. So this is what was changed when I installed our license file. You can see there's a whole bunch of stuff in the middle. and we're going to kind of just go through those. So it all looks like nonsense, basically, to me. But we can actually go and look at these files. They're all actually a standardized format of one kind or another. So these ones which are in that big blob in the middle, these are just essentially activation files with things like grace periods, and I think there's associations with who's signed in and activated what. Didn't look too interesting. This other file is an SQLite database, which doesn't have anything in it. So it's something that was meant only for the user running the package, which was var root. So nothing important there either. But it was interesting to take a look at, if I go back up, and I find there's these two XML files, and I've got two of those because I have, in this particular case, I've got two different Adobe apps installed. So I had a feeling that those ones might have something in them. I grabbed a copy of them before, so I just made an archive of those files in a folder on my desktop, and then grabbed these modified copies after I had installed the license package. And if I put them through a diff viewer, there's literally just two added lines to them, right? So it's pretty easy to just look at what the data is what is actually changing when you go and fix the problem. The Growl line is kind of funny because a long time ago, Adobe used to install Growl on your system when they installed old versions of CS, just so that they could send you a notification to update your software. So that's still there. So now this still gets added, but it doesn't do anything if you remove it. But the second line, this reg serial override line, knowing that, I could go back and see, take an application, an Adobe app that is having that problem showing the sign-in box, test that it's doing that before I add this line back, and as soon as I add the line back, that dialog went away. So, having proven to myself that was most likely what the issue was, is just that this one line was missing. I wrote a short Python script, which this is actually more code than is really important here. The main thing is just that we go through each of those XML files, check to see if that particular element is not there, and if it isn't, we just add it. And the rest of everything that's surrounding there is just sanity checking and making sure that it's not touching files that it shouldn't. The important thing also here is that it's idempotent, so I could run the script again and again, and it's not going to modify the files a second time, or it's not going to modify all 10 if it only has to modify one. You could do this again in something like Bash with other command line tools, but Python, it's much more clean, it's much more readable, it's safer. There's a built-in XML, several XML libraries built into Python. And this script actually will even work on Windows, because you can just add one line to say that on Windows the path is this instead of this. And if you can run the script on Windows, it actually works on Windows too. So I'll have a link to this at the end. This is still something that I'm kind of testing out, but some people I think have already tried it out and found that it's fixed this issue for them. So to kind of go into depth like this on an Adobe package and some internal details like this, it's not that interesting, the specifics, but it's more just to show that it's easy enough to take a look at the state of a system before and after you've gotten it to work the way that you want. And then using some kind of snapshot tools or the built-in file system monitoring tools that are there on OS X. You can go and look and see what's actually changed when you fix the problem, and then go back and see if you can script some solution to amend the issue yourself. So I've mostly been talking about functional problems with installers and applications, but there's often defaults we want to configure for the applications as well. And like I said, the most common one usually is that people want to disable automatic updates if they're already managing these with some kind of system. Sparkle is really a popular tool, which is an auto-update framework. You've all seen it. It looks like this whenever there's a new update for something. And you can look inside an application bundle, and you can see usually whether or not they use Sparkle. So it's nice the fact that it's a common system, because now you know that there's a single key that you set, so this SU enable automatic checks, and you set that in the application's preferences. You set it to false, and that will just turn off the updater for that particular app. There's even an open issue created on Sparkle for having like a global disable key that Sparkle would respect, and I don't think that's never been implemented, but for now we do it per application. And I use defaults as an example just to set this as a system default, but besides defaults, you can also use configuration profiles, especially if you're using MDM to do more of this management these days, then configuration profiles are definitely the way to go. And if you're writing scripts or other code, you can use Apple's own APIs, the same APIs that those applications are using and Sparkle uses, you can use those to configure the defaults as well. If an application doesn't use standard, Mac OS preferences, you have to look and see at other options if the vendor supports some kind of standard system-wide configuration path like this, which is what Flash Player supports, even though it's got Macromedia in the path. But by and large, I find that we're usually looking at solutions that will let you run a script when the user logs in and configure an application on behalf of the user. So Joe Chilcote wrote Outset, which is it's a pretty popular sort of framework for doing this. It's really just a launch agent and being able to run scripts from a configurable directory so that you can add or remove scripts per application that you deploy. And Per Olofsson also wrote this other more sophisticated tool, which is actually an authorization plugin. So it's quite different than Joe's solution. It lets you run scripts that run as root as well, but once the home folder has been already mounted. So it's actually more powerful, but it's also more invasive to the system. So this is just a quick example of how you might set preferences for Chrome, for example. So I would go and I would find the application preferences for Chrome, whittle that down to really just the bare minimum preference keys that I actually want to try to set, and make a copy of that outside, wipe the user's application folder for Chrome, and then try just copying in like a very minimal template, and then seeing if all the settings that you want are actually being set up as a default. Then what you would do is you would package that up, you would copy it to some world-readable, accessible location that any user can read from, so that when a user logs in, it's going to copy it from there into their home folder. And you can make these scripts either, they can do whatever you need them to do. So in this particular case, it will set up the bare minimum, skeleton user profile, like their Chrome profile folders, if it doesn't already exist. So that's a typical example, just for setting up a default. For figuring out what these paths would be, it's mostly just guesswork, and you can look and see in the sort of most common locations where applications, or most common locations where an app will store its configuration data. But you do sometimes have to use like these snapshotting tools to get a better look at exactly where things are getting written. And I pulled this from a lab machine just to kind of give just to see what a typical machine would look like. Just for configuring all those things that aren't configurable via config profiles or MCX or what have you. So setting up default profiles for Firefox or Chrome. Of these things, I think I counted about 11, which just do application settings, mostly disabling auto updates, and about 4 which do licensing. So there's applications where even for one of those has even like a license server which can only be configured per user. So there's things like that where you just need to figure out how you can configure the application on a per user level, and a solution like that is the way to do it. Okay, so just to finish this off, I mentioned that at the beginning in the Skype for Business installer, there's those 2 binaries that we don't really know what they're doing. You can run strings against a binary that you didn't write or you don't have the source code to, and you can try to sometimes guess at what it's doing or look for interesting clues about what strings are being used or what APIs are being used. But for Disassembler, it's a commercial tool that is a binary disassembler. And I find that it can be pretty useful for trying to figure these things out. So I'm just going to quickly, if I can manage to get this up. So this is the Skype for Business, the few scripts that came with that. And with Hopper, we just have to drop the binary, if I can get my trackpad to work. Okay. It's hard to do this with a podium. There we go. Okay. Once you load this, you see that it knows how to read MOTU binaries. Importantly, it will also go through and parse Objective-C sections that it recognizes. So on the left-hand side, if I look at strings, this is essentially what you would see when you run strings against a binary. Procedures, it does go through and it can try to pull out individual APIs that are being used and different method calls. If you see here, if you've ever done any work with preferences, you might recognize some of these CF preferences. And I picked this as an example because all the logic in this particular binary is all being done in the main function. What it's showing here in the middle is an assembler representation of the binary. So it goes through every byte and it essentially tries to reverse what the assembly instructions would have looked like to compose this. But what's the sort of, like, this doesn't really make much sense unless you really do understand assembler, which I don't for the most part. But the sort of killer feature of this app is that it also has this decompiler, which it calls pseudocode mode. And so when you look at this, suddenly what it's able to do is reorder this logically so that it actually starts to look closer to Objective-C code. And you can actually see the strings put in there as though they are like real function arguments. So what it looks like it's doing here, like, it's called register default app. We don't really know exactly what that means. But because of the fact that I saw that it's using these APIs that start with LS, so that's launch services, and I see that it's defining these strings called XMS presence. So that looks like a URL scheme, custom URL scheme, so that you can give somebody a link for this like MS presence, which I think is what their sort of status system is for their messaging platform, right? So that you could click a link in a website, for example, and it would launch Skype for Business and have all the context of who you are or who you're trying to connect to. So it's taking this string. You have to sort of often go back from the parts that you recognize and then kind of go back. And the variable names don't make sense because this is all still just like registers and memory locations. But you can still see logically what it's trying to do here. So it's copying reading the default handler that might be set for that URL scheme. It's checking, is it equal to com.microsoft.skype for business? If no, it's going to set the default handler for the URL scheme. So it's basically just going to register Skype for Business to be receiving calls to that URL scheme. And this is all being done, remember, in the context of the user, except that if you install it as root, then it actually doesn't configure this. So this wouldn't actually normally be configured. So if that's important to the functionality of the program, you'd probably actually have to run something like this, maybe steal their binary and run it as a post-install script or something, or as a login script for the user. And then it logs that it set the default handler. And then the second bit that it's doing here is just registering some preferences. So if you've done anything with Microsoft Auto Update, you might know that it has a system of registering applications for auto updates, so that if you open Word and you've never opened Skype for Business and it checks for updates, it's going to know to check updates for Skype for Business as well. And what's funny is they also do they do the equivalent of this in scripts in other installer packages that Microsoft ships. So for whatever reason, they decided to roll this all into one binary. But I thought it made a good example because usually when you open a larger binary with Hopper, you can't see all the stuff in one single main function. You have many different functions and you're sort of following along the logic from one to another. So this is really just to show what you can quickly get a glimpse at when you open a binary with this tool. It's also a full debugger and you can modify binaries. It's actually like really, really powerful if you know more than I do about about how to do this kind of stuff. But just for getting visibility into what an installer or an application configuration is doing. If you have to replicate it, then you can sometimes get more insight with something like this. And so I think with that, that's going to be the end if I can get my slides back up. yeah, that's just a view of what that shows. So yeah, so thank you. And then yeah, there's also a blog post that has all the links, everything that I've talked about as well. So if you want to find out more about anything here, you can go there. So thank you.
Hi guys, we've got time for probably 1 or 2 questions. If anyone has a question at all? We're all good?
Yes.
Okay. Go into the mic for me.
I'm not singing. It's just a very basic question. You said about the Adobe sign-in, and you said apart from the Casper Composer, what other snapshot tools are actually inbuilt with the OS?
Oh yeah, so there's a couple of those mentioned in that link. I cut those slides just to save time, but yeah, so there's one called fs_usage, which you can use, and that is really sort of a fire hose of every file system event that happens. But if you filter that with grep or something by the process that you know that you're looking for, then you can see just basically a list of every single read and write. But it's still so much information that it's useful for cases where you want to see like when it tries to read something. So sometimes actually an application might start up and the first thing it tries to do is read some undocumented, or maybe it tries to read from a system location for some preference that they don't really document, or so you can see like attempts to read and write, whereas in something like this composer view you wouldn't see that. People also used to use fs_eventer, and that still actually works, but you can't even really find it anymore to download. And when I did actually run that example through fs_eventer, it didn't find the modifications to the XML files. It only found changes with, it stopped at the directory, so it showed that there was changes to the directory, but not the XML files. So once I saw that, I actually figured probably not worth using fs_eventer anymore. And you also have to disable SIP, or some component of SIP, for some of the tools that are, there's other tools that can do this kind of thing as well, but some of them require you to actually disable part of SIP because it's like getting direct file system access.
Okay, thank you.